I now call on Deputy Tommy Broughan. You have 10 minutes, please.
Thanks, Catherine. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak on the bill. I note the bill is part of the Government and Minister Fitzgerald's pledged reform of policing and the overhaul of the legislative framework for Garda Síochana. These promised, of course, reforms arise out of the plethora of reports and controversies over the past year with the Cook, Gearan and Garda Inspectorate reports. I've always been strongly of the view that Garda Síochana should be managed by an independent Garda or policing authority, like in so many other jurisdictions. Of course, this was a policy of the Labour Party for many, many years, and it was perhaps most cogently expressed in a policy document by the Present Minister for Public Expenditure, Brendan Howlin, Deputy Brendan Howlin at the time. I welcome the Minister's commitment to establish the policing authority and her promise to publish the necessary legislation for the new authority in the coming months. I've been a long-time supporter of community policing. Indeed, I used to organise or help to organise Garda and community meetings for many, many years before the existing joint policing committees were established. And I have to say that the Garda in our Dublin Metropolitan Division in the north central area of Dublin City were always very supportive of those kind of meetings, even before the legislation existed. I spoke in the House earlier this year when members discussed serious allegations raised about Garda Síochana from claims made by whistleblowers, including Sergeant Maurice McKay. At that time, I said I agreed with the sentiments of the former Police Commissioner for Northern Ireland, Nuala O'Lone, about the deficiencies in the current structure and powers of GSOC as compared to the Northern Ireland Police Authority. Baroness O'Lone had said specifically there are 3 issues which would preclude her from ever taking up the role of Garda Ombudsman in this state, and they were the lack of powers of the GSOC to investigate the performance of a Garda Commissioner, and secondly, the lack of power GSOC had to access all of the information through Pulse, etc., that it requires from Garda Síochana to carry out its investigations, and 3, the fact that serving Gardaí are working inside GSOC in a liaison capacity. Only one of these fundamental issues, Minister, that's the extension of GSOC's power to investigate the Garda Commissioner, is actually addressed in the bill before us today, and some people have raised concerns even about the provisions of that, of Section 7, how it will operate. I do welcome the provisions contained in the Garda Síochana Amendment No. 3 bill, and I note it's part of a wider reform of policing in this country. However, it appears the bill doesn't go far enough in addressing the identified deficiencies with the operation of GSOC and the powers provided to it. It lacks clarity in some of its primary provisions, particularly in relation to when the time limit for making complaints actually kicks in, Minister, and the lack of express time frames for the Garda Síochana to be required to send necessary information to GSOC in order for GSOC to carry out its investigation. And those are matters that perhaps need to be looked at more closely. The bill is silent on some of the identified necessary reforms, such as taking the Garda Síochana completely out of GSOC to ensure full impartiality and independence. One of the core principles, as you know, of natural justice is nemo iudex in causa sui. No one should be a judge in his own case. For example, in other regulators, and I was a spokesperson over the years in various areas of various portfolios in communications, transport and so on, where you had regulators like, say, SER and Comreg, you wouldn't have existing members of the staff of, say, a telecoms company, somehow being embedded in Comreg, or you wouldn't have existing members of the staff of an energy company embedded in SER. And that's one of the lacunas, if you like, that still exists, I think, with this legislation. So you wouldn't have regulators, the people being regulated actually working within the regulator. While we continue to have members of the Gardaí involved in any capacity in the investigatory functions of GSOC, will not be true to the core principle of natural justice. This should be specifically addressed in the bill. I welcome the extension of GSOC's remit to include investigations concerning the Garda Commissioner. However, I would share the concerns expressed by some stakeholders and experts, including Professor Dermot Walsh, in relation to the apparent veto the Minister for Justice would have in any proposed investigation by GSOC regarding the Garda Commissioner. I also welcome the inclusion of a new power for GSOC to carry out investigations on its own initiative, which is very important. And I note, for example, that the Ombudsman for Children has always had the power to carry out an investigation at its own initiative under the Section 7 of the Children's Ombudsman Act. Furthermore, I welcome the strengthened powers of surveillance afforded to designated officers of GSOC to investigate complaints, particularly in relation to alleged criminal behaviour. I know that some concern has been expressed, about the extension of surveillance powers to GSOC and the potential this could interfere with ongoing criminal investigations by Garda Síochana. However, there's a mechanism in place for surveillance applications to be invigilated by the judiciary under Section 4 of the Criminal Justice Surveillance Act 2009 and other specific procedures for surveillance in cases of urgency in this Section 7. These provisions should afford the necessary safeguards for any surveillance applications made by designated officers of GSOC under the Criminal Justice Surveillance Act 2009 as amended by this bill. I'd just like to return to some of the concerns Cathaoirleach I have with the bill and the existing legislative framework for GSOC. This is based on my own experience of constituents interacting with GSOC and from briefings I've received from the Park Road Safety Group. Park has extensive experience in supporting families who've made complaints to GSOC about traffic collisions in particular. Firstly, it's repeatedly come to my attention that the existing 6-month time frame for initiating complaints is too short and has precluded some potential complaints from being afforded the opportunity to make a complaint to GSOC. And I note Section 4 amends Section 84 of the Garda Síochana Act and increases the permissible time limit for making complaints from 6 months to 12 months, while retaining the ability of GSOC to extend the time limit if there are good reasons for doing so. The increased time limit is welcome. However, the existing Section 84(1) of the 2005 legislation states, and I quote, "A complaint must be made within the period of 6 months beginning on the date of the conduct giving rise to the complaint or within any extension of that period allowed under subsection 2, end quote. There's a lack of clarity here, Minister, about when the time limit actually begins from. Specifically, does the time limit kick in from the actual date of an incident occurring giving rise to a complaint or the date upon which a complainant became aware of the conduct which gives rise to the complaint? I recognise that this is a somewhat technical issue, but in practice a lack of clarity about when the time limit kicks in has been prohibited for some complainants, particularly complainants who have gone through traumatic situations and already find the GSOC complaint system difficult to navigate. Another issue that's been raised with me, Minister, which I know is not addressed in the bill, is in the area of discipline and sanctions imposed where a complaint in relation to a member of Garda Síochana has been accepted and upheld by GSOC. As far as I'm aware, there's no obligation on the Garda Síochana to inform GSOC or complainants about the disciplinary sanctions imposed on a member who has been found by GSOC to have been involved in misbehaviour. This is something that could and should be addressed, Minister, in the legislation, and perhaps the Minister Fitzgerald might consider amending the bill to bring more clarity and transparency to the legislation so that complainants have an idea about how satisfactorily their complaints have been addressed. Another issue I'd like to raise is the express provision in Section 9 of the bill, which inserts a new section after Section 103 of the 2005 Act, and requires the Garda Síochana to supply information necessary to carry out investigations to GSOC as soon as practicable. I acknowledge the express inclusion of this requirement in the bill. I also acknowledge that the tardy exchange of information between Gardaí and GSOC has rightly been a point of contention and is now the subject of revised protocols, and many other deputies have raised that point in the House. However, the provision now in the bill in relation to the exchange of information could be much more robust, Minister, and it should include specific timeframes during which the Gardaí would be compelled to supply information requested by GSOC which has been deemed necessary for investigations. A related concern in the area of access to information is the lack of an express provision in the bill for designated officers of GSOC to have access to the Pulse system. I note that the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Justice, Defence and Equality in its report on the review of Garda Síochana Act 2005 recommended that access to Pulse for GSOC be put on a statutory footing and not by way of protocol. So that's, if you like, our dedicated committee of this House made that recommendation, Minister, and the committee's report further states, and I quote, "Access to Garda systems is of integral importance to the operation of effective oversight of Garda Síochana," end quote. The Minister's stated aim of this bill and reform of the 2005 Act is to improve confidence in policing and strengthen the powers of GSOC. However, it seems that GSOC will not be in a position to adequately carry out some investigations without being permitted to access Pulse. Final point I'd like to raise is to ask, who and how will the activities of by whom and how will the activities of GSOC itself be invigilated? I know that Vicky Conway, who has written extensively on policing matters, has suggested that it's unclear how a member of the public will complain about GSOC's performance or use of its powers. In other words, quis custodiet custodies, who actually guards the guardians, the famous phrase we often use about the Garda Síochana itself, who makes sure that if they do their job, that GSOC does its job. So I assume there'll be some oversight by the new policing authority, but perhaps the Minister might clarify in her return speech this matter for us. So again, Cathaoirleach, I'd like to give a general welcome to the legislation as a first small step towards bringing about necessary reforms to policing in Ireland and the oversight of Garda Síochana. Of course, as I've already pointed out, there are a number of outstanding issues that need to be addressed, particularly in relation to the information which can be accessed by GSOC designated officers and the timeframes in which information must be provided by GSOC to GSOC by Garda Síochana. I also believe that serving Gardaí cannot be working in GSOC in any capacity, as this completely undermines the independence of the GSOC organisation. I hope some of the other issues I've raised, which would merit further clarity in legislation, especially in relation to when the time limit for making a complaint kicks in, will be addressed, either at committee stage or in the further promised legislation which the Minister plans to bring forward. And just final point, obviously, a lot of deputies, Minister, as you know, read very carefully the recent Garda Inspectorate report. I raised it myself. I noticed a former fellow member here of one of the local GPCs in my own constituency, how, in fact, Garda statistics, in particular crime statistics, are collated and presented to the public and to us. And that's an area where there are some concerns. I was assured by my own the Chief Superintendent of our region, Chief Superintendent Frank Clarkin, that the statistics we're presented with on a bi-monthly or tri-monthly basis are statistics that our Gardaí can stand over, and I believe that to be the case. But this Garda Inspectorate report, it was quite disturbing, and it's again something I would hope the Minister would respond to and provide a debate in this House on. Thanks, Cathaoirleach.
Thank you, Deputy.